Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we delve further into the wisdom of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply appreciate your support. Please take a moment to like and share this audiobook, helping us expand its reach and granting more individuals access to its profound insights. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can disseminate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner peace. Your participation in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible is truly invaluable. Let's begin today's reading. Wisdom for Dummies Revisited. February 4, 2017. We like to think of Buddhist wisdom as something subtle and abstract. And there are aspects of the Buddha's teachings that are subtle and abstract. But wisdom has to start with some very basic things, too. You might call it wisdom for dummies. And that means you're not going to get to the higher levels until you've mastered the basics. There are two ways in which the Buddha talks about very basic levels of wisdom. One is if there's something that you like to do but is going to give bad results, you know how to talk yourself out of it. The other is that if there's something that you don't like to do but is going to give good results, you're able to talk yourself into it. In other words, you learn how to psych yourself up. You learn to look at the long term rather than the short term. And you try to figure out what the problem is with your attitude, how you can get around your laziness. We were talking this afternoon about laziness when getting up in the morning. There's a passage in the canon where the Buddha talks about the different excuses people give for laziness. I didn't get enough sleep last night, I'm tired, I worked yesterday, I'm going to be working tomorrow, I came back from a trip yesterday, I'm going on a trip tomorrow, I've been sick. And then he compares those with the reasons that another person might give for being more energetic in the practice. And it turns out they're the same reasons. I worked a lot yesterday, but now I've got a chance to meditate today, I'm going to be working tomorrow, but I've got this chance to meditate now, I've been sick, but finally I've gotten over that, so I can meditate some. I may still be weak, but the illness could come back. So here's my chance. In other words, there's no difference in the objective situation. The difference is in your attitude. So if the voices to get you more energetic are not there in your mind, try to learn some of them. Because you're not the only one who likes to sleep in late. Everybody likes to sleep in late. Ajahn Mahabua complained about how lazy he was. And here he was. Someone who eventually could sit 5 or 6 hours as if it were nothing. We all have to figure out some way to get around our laziness. At the same time, there are things we like to do that we have to learn how to say no to. Learn how to see their drawbacks. At the very least, put up a fight. All too often, the voices in the mind say, you're going to be giving in anyhow in 5 minutes, so why don't you give in now, so we don't have to waste a lot of time and energy. You can respond and say, well, I don't know about 5 minutes from now, but right now I'm responsible for right now. So if it's something I should do, I'm going to do it now. If it's something I shouldn't do, I won't be doing it now. We'll talk about 5 minutes in 5 minutes' time. Another one of the reasons they'll give is, you'll get up and meditate, but you're not going to last very long, so why bother? So you say, at least I'll get up, get into position, and then we'll talk from there. It's not like you're committed, that once you get up you have to meditate. But you say, well, at least give it a try. The same when you find yourself doing something you shouldn't be doing. You've started doing it and part of the mind will say, well, now that you started, you're committed and you might as well go all the way. You say, no. I can stop. So learn how to psych yourself up. It's all very simple, but the problem is that you tend to identify with certain voices in the mind, and they make it complex. You've got to learn how to withdraw your sense of identification from them, and learn to see those voices as not self. Again, we like to think of the not-self teaching as something very abstract and subtle. But it's something we're doing all the time, we're not selfing all the time in order to self new things. You self an idea and then another idea comes up, So you not self the first idea, and then self the second one. Learn to be a little more systematic about how you do that. Learn to view your sense of self and the activity of not selfing as tools. Then ask yourself, when is it skillful to identify with this idea? And when is it skillful to identify with that idea? You have the freedom to choose. Selfing is a verb. It's an activity, a kind of karma. And as with all kinds of karma, the question is, when is it skillful? When is it not? So give yourself a little more freedom around this issue. The idea that you're committed to being a certain way or a certain sort of person, that gets in the way of the practice. If everybody were committed to being the way they already were, the Buddha wouldn't have bothered teaching. It wouldn't have served any purpose at all. But he saw that we can train ourselves. Part of the mind can train the rest of the mind. It's simply a matter of getting the good part of the mind, the part that really does wish for your true well-being, to have more power. This is one of the reasons why, when we meditate, we work with the breath to gain a sense of well-being. The good part of the mind needs help. And working with the breath gives the rest of the mind a sense of well-being as well, gives the whole body a sense of well-being so that the next time you think about meditating, you'll have a good association with it. You remember that once you make the effort of settling in, it feels really, really good. That becomes your incentive to get up early the next morning and to try it again. The other basic role of wisdom is that when things go wrong, when things don't go well in life, you learn to give yourself pep talks. This can apply to the meditation. Everyone is going to have barren stretches in the meditation. It's common. There are times, at the beginning, when things are opening up inside, all kinds of new and interesting things are happening, but then it levels out, and you're stuck with the same old, over and over again. Well, learn how to see that maybe something else is going on in that same old mind that you're not seeing right now. Sometimes the mind makes some progress, and then it has to fill in the details. It makes a quick sketch, and then it has to fill in the rest of the sketch, and it's going to take time. I had a Thai friend who was an artist. Sometimes he would do large traditional Thai paintings. He was working once on a large painting of Rama, and his wife came into the studio one afternoon after he'd been working for hours on little tiny details. She looked at the painting and said, "Oh, you didn't get much done today, did you?" He said, "I've been working all day." There are parts of the mind where you have to fill in the details before you're going to be able to move on. So learn how to keep yourself in a good mood in the meantime. Maybe the results aren't coming as quickly as possible, or the changes aren't coming as quickly as you'd like, but just keep with it, keep with it, keep with it. Think of the Shackleton expedition. They lost their ship down near Antarctica. Help was hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And their situation was pretty bleak. But the captain gave them good pep talks, and he looked after everyone. He made sure that all the men did what they could and what they should. They'd all learned, this is what you have to do in a situation like this, and so he made sure everybody did just that. He said, at the very least, if we die, we'll know we're not dying from our carelessness or our own laziness. If we die doing our duty, that's an honorable death. And they all made their way out. So as you're meditating, you're not going to die from the meditating, but at the very least say, I'm going to do it well. I'm going to stick with the steps. I don't want to fail in meditation because of carelessness. Oftentimes, when progress is not happening, it's because you're getting sloppy in the details. So go back and think about step 1, step 2, step 3. And don't think that it's embarrassing to go back to step 1, 2, or 3. Ajahn Lee's images of a path over which you walk back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, many times. He says, 1. The path gets worn smooth, and 2. You see little details you wouldn't have noticed if you walked through it just once. A lot of this has to do with the fact that the mind is a complex thing, and sometimes you have to go over the same things again and again and again to see all the implications. So that's another aspect of basic wisdom or wisdom for dummies. Of course, this kind of wisdom is not going to keep you dumb. In fact, it's the kind of wisdom that gets you out of being a dummy. The dummies are the ones who want to learn about emptiness and dependent co-arising all at once without having any foundation. All they get are perceptions, labels in the mind. They don't actually see where these teachings are useful and why they're useful tools. The Buddha didn't teach these things just to show off how smart he was. Everything he taught was for a purpose. And when your mind is ready, then you see, oh, this serves that purpose. When you've gotten more skillful at selfing and not selfing your ideas, for example, you've got a good foundation for how to use the not-self teaching in the most skillful way possible. People who don't have that background, though, can take the not-self teaching and use it to shoot themselves in the foot. Ajahn Lee gives the example of people who want to get gold out of rock. They see somebody taking a big pickaxe and carrying big loads of rock back to the smelter, and they say to themselves, "That's dumb. Who wants all that rock? All you want is the gold." So they go and take a little tiny toothpick to get just the gold right out of the rock, but it doesn't work that way. You have to take the rock and put it in the smelter and subject it to heat, and then the metals tin, lead, copper, silver, and gold will come melting out of their own accord. In other words, you focus on the practical details of making right effort, even if they seem mundane. That's what the smelter stands for. And the gold will appear in your mind. There's a lot in the meditation that you can't anticipate. You can't plan too far ahead. But you know, these are the steps. We're lucky that we have them laid out for us. Ajahn Lee's 7 steps in his method too. If there's something going wrong in your meditation, look and see which of the steps you're not getting right or which ones you're getting sloppy about. Then you just keep doing them again and again and again. And give yourself pep talks. It's like any manual skill that involves a lot of repetitive actions, like sharpening a knife on a whetstone. When you're sharpening a knife, you have to be alert. And you have to be very sensitive to make sure that you're not ruining the blade by making some parts too sharp or wearing down some parts too much and others not enough. The edge of the blade has to be very even and smooth. So you have to give yourself pep talks as you're sitting there, rubbing the blade over the stone, over the stone, over the stone, again and again and again. If you keep your spirits up, you find that you can make your way through and do the job well. This may be one of the reasons why the Ajahns and Zen masters of old would have you learn a manual skill before you meditated, because the qualities of mind that go into mastering a skill are precisely the qualities of mind you need to meditate. But they're basic not because they're dumb. They're basic because they're important. They're essential to everything else. 1. The teaching on learning how to put the long term ahead of the short term. And 2. The teaching on how not to let things get you down when the long term seems long. Every other aspect of wisdom, no matter how refined, comes out of these 2 principles. They're the habits that will help see you all the way through. Defilements are real. February 14, 2017. A lot of people don't like the word defilement. This is true not just of modern people in the West. Even way back in Buddhist history there were people who said, well, as long as you realize that the defilements are not real, then they have no power over you, and that's the end of the problem. That particular attitude is managed to hang on in the Buddhist tradition up to now. But the problem with that is if you say that the defilements like greed, aversion, and delusion aren't real, that they're not even defilements, it's like saying that when there's dirt in your house, it's not really dirt. It's just a natural part of the floor and a natural part of the wall, so you're just going to leave it there. You'll never know what it's like to have a really clean house. The whole purpose in having a teaching on defilement is to realize that the mind could be a lot brighter than it is. Maybe it's true that a dirty house is natural, but a clean house is possible, and it's a much nicer house to live in. In the same way, the Buddha saying that a clean mind is possible, and a much nicer mind to be with as well. So instead of taking the word defilement as an affront to your dignity, think of it as a very useful concept for living well. After all, there are parts of the mind that get in the way of practicing virtue, there are parts that get in the way of practicing concentration, get in the way of practicing discernment. Those are defilements. If they're cleaned away from the mind's going to be a lot brighter. How do you clean them away? 1. You learn how to gain a sense of distance from them. The reason they have power over us is that they disguise themselves as us. Greed comes in, we assume that it's our greed, it's the way we feel about that particular object we want, and it's our wanting. The same with anger. We're angry. Delusion sneaks up on us and doesn't even let us know it's there, but it's there, and we identify with whatever deluded ideas it may bring. This is where the concept of the committee of the mind is very useful. All too often we see the committee of the mind as a problem, in that the mind has so many desires, so many different wants, and there's so much conflict inside. All those different voices can often get in the way of getting the mind to settle down and be still. But the positive side of having a committee is that you can identify with the discernment, you can identify with the mindfulness, you can identify with all the other good voices in the mind. That allows you to step back from the voices of greed, aversion, and delusion, too. Look at them from the outside. After all, when you look at anger in somebody else, it's obviously a problem. You look at greed in somebody else, it's obviously a weakness. So you want to be able to see your own anger and your own greed in the same way. This is why we develop the path. We develop all the different strengths of the mind that the Buddha talks about. Conviction in the Buddha's awakening, conviction in the power of action, persistence in trying to give rise to skillful qualities and abandon unskillful ones, mindfulness to keep all this in mind. So that the mind can get into concentration and have a sense of its home where it can stay apart from the greed, aversion, and delusion, and then the discernment to take them apart. When greed comes in, you want to be able to see why you're attracted to it. The same with anger, lust, jealousy. These things all have their attractive side. If you don't admit that to yourself, you'll never be able to get past them. But you also have to see the drawbacks. It's in seeing the drawbacks and weighing them against the attractive side. That's when you can finally get past them, because you can see that they really are stains on the mind. They really obscure a lot of the clarity that could be there in the mind. You're better off without them. The problem, of course, is that we tend to feed off of their allure, thinking that the allure is what gives spice to life. That's the flavor that we get from the greed or the aversion or the lust or the jealousy. So we need a sense of well-being in the concentration as our food, while we peel away from our old feeding habits. We realize that the spices have been hiding the fact that we've been feeding on dirt. It's like that Far Side cartoon where the cows are in the pasture, and one of them jerks her head up and says, "Hey, wait a minute. This is grass. We've been eating grass. Well, we've been eating dirt. We've been eating all the stains in the mind. But because they're dressed up with a little bit of spice, we think they're really good. So now we've got to feed the mind on better things." The food of concentration may not be as exciting, it may not be as spicy, but it is nourishing and does strengthen the mind. With that strength, we can withstand some of the appeal of those defilements. We can step back from them and say, this really is dirt in the mind. We're ready to start cleaning it away, learning to see where we perceive the attraction, where we perceive the need to identify with these things, and learning to question that. A lot of discernment lies in questioning things we don't usually question, things we simply assume to be unavoidable. The mind's going to have these emotions, we assume. Well, why? Why do we have to run with them? When they do come up, why do we have to embroider them further? It's not the case that they simply arise full-blown on their own. We're implicated in the process. A little something comes into the mind, a little stirring, and depending on what we want at that point, we identify the stirring as that thing, and then we run with it. So you have to question the perceptions you apply to these things. When something gets you angry, take the perception apart. Is what that person has said or done really all that bad? And even if it is all that bad, is anger justified? Or rather, is it helpful? If it's something you really have to deal with, anger's going to get in the way because you're not going to be able to see things clearly. The same with greed. You start doing all kinds of foolish things under the power of greed. The same with lust. These things make us their slaves. So however you perceive the drawbacks, whether it's just as a stain on the mind that obscures its clarity, or something that comes in and turns you into a slave, whatever you can see to realize that these are things you don't want to get involved with, recognize that they're there and learn how to pull yourself away from them. When the Buddha said that the mind is luminous and the defilements come in and visit, he's not saying that we have a pure nature to begin with. If our nature were pure, then we wouldn't go for the defilements anyhow. The luminous quality of the mind means that there's a clarity to it, that you can actually see the things you're doing. You can begin to see that when you follow a particular unskillful state, these are the consequences. You can also see when the unskillful state arises in the mind. You can start seeing the stages by which it comes, in the place where there's a little bit of allure, and you go for the allure, and then you swallow the whole hook along with the bait. It's this luminous quality of the mind that allows us to see these things, to step back from the greed or the aversion or the delusion or any of the other subsidiary defilements. And then we benefit. We realize that the mind is a lot cleaner than it was before, a lot brighter than it was before. It's less likely to be picked up by these things and dragged around. And that's when you see the benefit of the teachings. It's really good to be reminded again and again and again. Greed, aversion, and delusion are stains on the mind. They're faults in the mind. And there's a way to get past them. The fact that we can have different committee members in the mind allows us to step away from the unskillful ones. If the mind were totally one identity and it were defiled by nature, there would be nothing you could do. You'd have to wait for some help from outside. But the fact is that the mind does have that clarity, that luminous nature, where it can see what's going on inside. And the committee has skillful members that can be strengthened, so they can step back and view the defilements as alien, as something that doesn't have to be there, something that's intruded into the mind. All of this means you can do something about this yourself. You can clean out your mind. So remember that the mind could be a lot brighter than it is, a lot happier than it is. Some people take that as a burdensome thought that there's more work to be done, because they'd like to hear that there's nothing more they need to do. Which means that they just want to live with the dirt and tell themselves that it's not dirt. But they never get to see what a really clean mind would be like. The Buddha's telling you about your defilements, not to burden you with an extra unpleasant duty, but to provide you with an opening, a possibility where you could find what it's like to have a really good mind with a goodness that's so good, a cleanliness so clean, that you'll never need anything else. So see the teaching on defilement as something that's really helpful and kind, and not as a personal affront. That'll allow you to get the most out of it. Inside is a judgment call. September 29, 2016. When the great Ajahns were practicing in the forest, they were out there alone. What kept them going was the realization that they weren't really alone. They belonged to something much larger. They belonged to the culture of the noble ones. This is a culture you can join simply by adopting its values. And you want to remind yourself of those values, especially in this land of wrong view, because otherwise you start feeling lonely. You start feeling that you're the only person practicing, and your values aren't in line with those of other people. And those people don't just sit by and watch neutrally. Most people try to push you in their direction. To do what they do, think the way they think. So think about how the noble ones would respond to that pressure. Ajahn Fuang's image one time was of people who have stepped in dog shit, and then want to make sure everybody else steps in dog shit, too. You've got to think in those terms if you want your practice to survive. So think about the values of the customs of the noble ones. There are 4 altogether. The first 3 have to do with contentment. You're content with whatever food, clothing, or shelter you get. You're not constantly thinking about ways to make the food better, or the clothing better, or the shelter better. There may be times when you feel that something's really lacking. But if these things serve their purpose, and this is one of the reasons why we have that reflection every evening to remember what that purpose is, then you've got enough. You really don't need to be ambitious to make yourself large in the world, just for the sake of more food, more clothing, or more shelter. Even if you have 1,000 sets of clothing, you can only wear one at a time. And that thought frees you. It frees you from all the extra work you'd have to do to get things that are basically extraneous, that are there only for show. That allows you to focus on the most important of the customs of the noble ones, which is to delight in developing skillful qualities, and to delight in abandoning unskillful qualities. In other words, you want to make yourself want to do these things. Sometimes it doesn't happen naturally, even when you're practicing. There are times when the momentum begins to wear out. You need to give yourself pep talks to remind yourself of why you're doing this and why it's a good thing. You're learning to make a judgment call as to what's worth doing, what's not, and taking delight in what is really worth doing. The mind calculates these things all the time. There's a part of the brain that keeps saying, is this worth it, the energy that goes here? Or would the energy go better there? That's a basic function of the mind. The problem is that it often malfunctions, based either on our own past experiences or on our own lack of clarity as to what the results of our actions will be. So a lot of the training is learning how to read our actions so that we can make a better judgment call as to what's worth doing, what's not. Wisdom begins with those questions. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? Look at everything in terms of actions, this reality that we're trapped in, that we've created, that we keep on creating through our own fabrication. You could say it's a web of fabrication. It sounds like a web of lies, which is not quite what the word fabrication means here. It's simply something that's put together. We're constantly assembling it. And it's constantly falling apart. So we keep assembling it some more. We're driven to do this because we like to feed on these things. We think it's worth the effort that goes into it, so that we can get the food that comes out of our efforts. The problem is that sometimes we're impatient. We want the food right now, so we're not too picky about what we get right now. As long as we get something right now, we're happy. This is one of the reasons why, as we practice, we try to find alternative sources of food, try to get another visceral pleasure, aside from the pleasure of sights, sounds, tastes, smells, tactile sensations. We need the pleasure of concentration as a substitute. As the Buddha once said, you can know all the drawbacks of sensuality, but if you don't have an alternative pleasure, such as the pleasure of right concentration, then you're going to go back to feeding off all the old things that you told yourself were bad, because you don't see the alternative. It's not immediately there. So the pleasure of concentration is one of the ways we keep ourselves sustained on the path. The Buddha, when he was describing the Noble Eightfold Path, at one point called right concentration the main factor, while the rest were the auxiliary or helping factors. Right concentration is where you get to use pleasure in a skillful way, a pleasure you gain while staying focused on the breath. But at the same time, you learn an important lesson about pleasure. That if you go running after the pleasure, you're going to lose the cause. So you stick with the cause and enable the pleasure to develop on its own. And it'll do its work. You don't have to gobble it down. It'll suffuse through the body, nourish whatever immediate need you feel for a sense of well-being. And that puts you in a better place to make a better judgment about what's worth doing, what's not. When the Buddha talks about developing discernment from those first two questions, a lot of it focuses on actions. There's the discernment that comes with learning how to get yourself to do things you don't like to do, but you know are going to give good long-term results. And the discernment that gets you to stop yourself from doing things that you like to do, but are going to cause long-term harm. This kind of discernment is practical, strategic. And we develop it how? By being virtuous, by doing virtuous things, by being generous, by giving. And we gain discernment by acting. The Buddha recommends good ways to act. He says that if you act this way, you're going to get good results. You put it to the test and you find that it's true. There is a sense of well-being. When you give something, the well-being that you gain inside is worth much more than the object you gave. And it's much more yours. It becomes your karma now. It becomes a habit, a quality of the mind. The same with virtue, when you really put virtue into practice by following the precepts. Try to make it an absolute promise to yourself that you're going to stick to these precepts. You catch yourself about to do things that you used to do, and you used to think were okay, but you stop. You realize that they have their drawbacks. And again, you have to learn how to think strategically, so that you can stick to the precept not to lie and not to kill, even in situations where it's difficult. But you learn, with time, that you're a happier person. So you gain discernment by learning how to act properly. This makes you more and more sensitive to the role you play in shaping your experience. Then you finally get to the subtler levels of discernment, for example, the Buddha's questionnaire on inconstancy, stress, and not self. The teaching on not self is not meant to make you come to the conclusion that there is no self. It's meant to get you to ask a question. Is it worth it in this situation to create a sense of self? To make a me or a mine? You learn how to apply those questions strategically. In other words, while you're developing concentration, you don't apply them to the concentration. You apply them to the things that would pull you away. When you're trying to be virtuous, when you're trying to be generous, again, you apply those questions to things that would pull you away from these practices. It's only when the path is fully developed that you apply those questions to everything. Notice, it's a value judgment. You ask yourself, is it worth saying, this is me? This is mine? Insight is always a judgment call. And you want to learn how to delight in making more and more skillful judgments. I was talking on this theme a few days ago to a Buddhist group in the Bay Area. A woman came up afterwards and said, "Gee, thinking about how my actions shape my life. That's putting a whole new perspective on things. It means my life isn't shaped by my DNA." And my answer was, well, yes. This is what the Buddha's talking about. You shape your life. He's putting you in a position of power. The question is, are you going to maintain that position of power, or are you going to succumb to the parts of the mind that don't want to put all the effort into being skillful? If you try to maintain that position of power, you're following the culture of the noble ones. This is one way of motivating yourself. Taking a sense of joy, delighting in what you're doing. You can motivate yourself through heedfulness. You can motivate yourself through skillful shame, skillful pride, compassion. Compassion for others, compassion for yourself. Or you could do it simply through the pride that comes from learning how to do something skillfully. To make more and more skillful judgment calls. Another person that evening said to me, "You're making it sound all very ordinary and psychological." Well, that's how it starts. You start by looking at yourself as an agent and asking yourself, how can I be a more skillful agent? How can I make my decisions more skillfully? And you pursue this more and more to deeper levels, subtler levels, where you find out what you're taking apart is not so ordinary. You get to a very deep level, and the effect it has on your experience of the senses gets very radical. It opens you up to another dimension. There is a dimension that is unfabricated. It doesn't require that you keep tending to it and keep feeding it or keep feeding off it. Everything is unconditioned in that dimension, and it doesn't require all this constant care. It doesn't require an agent. And opening up to that dimension is very radical. The final acts on the path that allow you to do that are judgment calls as well. So if you're going to learn how to get to that radical level, you have to first develop the ordinary, everyday level of learning to be more skillful in how you speak, and how you think and how you act, looking again and again at what you're doing. Remembering what you should be doing and looking to see if you actually are doing it. Like the lesson we had about the clothesline today. You remember which side of the robe to expose to the sun, and then you check to make sure that that's the side of the robe you're exposing. And then you look at the results. The robe doesn't fade so quickly. Simple things like that, but you move from the simple things to the subtler ones. And there's a greater sense of self-esteem that comes as you learn to make more and more precise and skillful judgment calls in all the areas of your life. So remember, as you go through the day, that everything you do is a choice. Everything you do involves intention. And if you learn how to look carefully at them, these intentions and these choices, and stick with the desire to be as skillful as possible, to be a member of that noble culture, the culture of the noble ones, you find that you actually do take more and more joy and more delight in developing what's skillful, abandoning what's unskillful, and the results go deeper and deeper. As Luang Pu Dun once said, the practice is one thing clear through. He didn't say what that one thing was. It's actually a cluster of things, but they all work together. One of them is this ability to make better and better judgment calls. That's what your discernment is, that's what insight is. It's a practice that, on whatever level, you notice that you're making a decision, making a choice, and in trying to do that skillfully, you see how the path and all the areas of your life connect. The Train Trestle. December 30, 2016. Put aside the world outside for a while and focus on the world inside. What have you got here? You've got the body, particularly, you've got the breath, you've got feelings, and you've got the mind. You want to bring those all together in a way that's nourishing for all three. Take a couple of good long, deep in and out breaths. Notice where you feel the breathing in the body. Some aspects of the breathing will be more obvious than others. Focus on the areas that are most obvious, or the ones that you feel most sensitive to. There's a spot in the body that you usually use to mark when the breath has come in enough, so that you know, now it's time for it to go out. Now it's gone out enough. It's time for it to come back in. Find that spot. If there's any tension or tightness around it, let it loosen up. This way, the breath immediately relates to feelings, which you begin to see don't just come and go on their own. You do things to induce them. There are certain limits to what you can do. This has to do with past karma, but within the limits of what you've got here, you want to make the best use of the potentials you've got. As for the mind, is it willing to stay here right now? Sometimes, if it's not staying, the problem is with the breath or with the feelings. Sometimes it's with the thoughts going on in the mind. Things left over from the day. If you find a lot of leftover stuff, sort through it a bit. Imagine the Buddha's point of view, and think of what he would have to say about the issues that are coming up in your mind right now, how he might advise you to take a larger view, let them go. Then you're ready to get back with the breath. What you're doing here is creating what's called a state of becoming. Becoming is a sense of a particular world of experience and your identity in that world. Right now, you're the meditator, and the relevant world is the world of your body right here, together with your awareness of the body. This world is based on a desire. The desire to get the mind to settle down, to find some peace in the present moment. And based on that desire, you have to adjust things. You adjust the breath. You adjust your thoughts. You adjust your feelings. All that's called fabrication. It's how we create our inner world. It's how we create our outer worlds as well. This is one of the reasons why getting the mind in a good state of concentration like this, with the proper understanding, is such a good laboratory. You look at the world outside and it seems pretty confusing. You say, how could I have created this? You didn't create everything, but you created your experience of it. And the problem is that worlds don't just sit there. They move. And you don't just sit there, either. You move too. You find that you can't stay in a particular world, so you move on to another one, and then another one, because the mind is constantly trying to find some place to stay in worlds that keep collapsing and disintegrating. Sometimes it moves out of desperation, sometimes it's feeling threatened, so it tends to piece things together pretty quickly, pretty haphazardly, not knowing what it's doing. That's why we find ourselves in situations where we can't imagine why we got there or how we would have wanted to be there. We didn't want to be there. Our desires were pointing someplace else, but they were confused. Confused and ignorant. So we're trying to learn how to do this process with more knowledge and more skill. At the same time, in creating a state of concentration like this, we give ourselves a place to step back out of other worlds. You notice this very clearly as you get distracted by something. You're in another world. There's kind of a blacking out, and suddenly you're someplace else. But you can remind yourself, I'm meditating. You can pull yourself back. You've got another place to return to. A place that's more solid, that's not collapsing around you all the time. There is some impermanence here, some inconstancy, but relative to a lot of other things in life, this state of concentration is pretty constant. It allows you to put down your guard a bit. As the Buddha said, settle in here. Indulge in the pleasure of the concentration, because the mind needs that sense of pleasure. Otherwise, it's going to go out looking for other things to wolf down. Allow the sense of pleasure to develop and let it spread throughout the whole body. See if you can get it to spread to places you haven't been thinking about for a while, areas that you might tend to forget. This is why it's good to have a systematic way of going through the body with a checklist. But even those systems can miss some things. So cast your gaze around and see what needs to be soothed in the body, energized in the body, or relaxed in the body, so that this becomes a good place to stay. You're going to try to move into this world, and it's like moving into a house. You want to make it a home, a place where you can feel at your ease. And while you're doing this, you learn a lot about how the mind builds homes. That was the Buddha's image after his awakening. He realized that he had had a house builder in his mind that kept on building new houses, again and again. It fashioned new houses as the old houses collapsed, and moved into the new ones. But then the new ones collapsed, too, sometimes even when they were still under construction, so he had to build more. And finally, on awakening, he realized he had reached a state that wasn't built and wasn't going to collapse. He didn't need the house builder anymore. This is a useful image to apply to your life. See how you're building houses. Are you building them on sand or are you building them on solid rock? What are they exposed to? Some houses are exposed to more dangers than others. This is another reason why you want to have a good place inside, because it's a lot less exposed. At the same time, you can see more clearly this process of how you fabricate things. You see which thoughts, which feelings, and which physical sensations you tend to latch onto and what you create out of them. This way, you learn to do it with more knowledge, more finesse. Think about samsara. An image that springs to mind is one of those cartoons where Bugs Bunny is in a train going over a big railroad trestle over a huge chasm. As the train goes along, the trestle's collapsing behind him. So he's got to keep going, and going. Where samsara is different from this image is that in the cartoon, the part of the trestle ahead of him is already there, whereas when we're going through life, some of the things that we're going to be running to are already determined, but a lot of them are not. We're scrambling to build the train trestle ahead of us, hoping that it'll reach the other side. And all too often, we do it with greed, aversion, delusion, envy, jealousy. All kinds of unskillful mind states, along with that sense of being threatened by the collapse of things behind us. So we tend to do a shoddy job, which is why we find ourselves in worlds that we wouldn't like to be in. So here, as we meditate, we have a chance to get a better sense of how the mind fabricates things. Again, it's not total world creation. In other words, you can't create something out of nothing. You've got raw material coming in from past karma, which sometimes can place severe limitations on what you can do. But you always have the choice to do something skillful with it. That choice is always there. It's simply that we're latching on to other things that make us push the skillful alternative aside. If you give the mind a more solid place like this, you can do your work with clearer vision, a lot more patience, but at the same time, you can be more efficient in how you put together the right way to be in a particular world. So even though there may be some situations where there's going to be a lot of pain or a lot of confusion, you don't have to suffer from the pain or be confused about what you're doing. That puts you in a better position to help yourself and other people, too. Because if everything in your life is going up in flames and you try to help somebody else who's going up in flames, sometimes you just add more fire to theirs. But if you're in a cool, safe place, you can pull those other people out to whatever extent they want to be pulled. So this is not a selfish process. Our worlds intersect, So the way you create your world, if it's done with skill, will have a good influence on other people. We're here to get to know this aspect of the mind that's building houses, building railroad trestles, so that we can have better and better places to move into until eventually we get to where the trestle reaches the other side. That's when we're safe. Until then, it's going to keep collapsing behind us. Even as we sit here meditating, things are collapsing behind us. Worlds where we've been in the past. They're gone. Even the past moment is gone. Forever. We have to look at what worlds we're creating right now and what worlds they're going to lead to, on into the future. As the Buddha said, we're all on a path of one sort or another, and those paths have their different destinations. All too often, we don't realize what the destination is. Some people get themselves on the path to the lower destinations. They haven't chosen that destination, but the path they've chosen is going to take them there. It's out of ignorance that they're headed in that direction. This is why it's good to have the Dhamma to give us a clear sense of what paths there are in the world and what kinds of actions lead in what direction, so we can choose wisely and construct something that'll take us to safety. The Burning House. May 4, 2016. We focus on the present moment so that we give the mind a sense of feeling at home here. This is the place where you belong. Now, for most of us, we don't live here. We live in the past, we live in the future, and come running through the present moment just for a moment, like a kid who doesn't spend much time at home. He wants something from home, comes running in, and then he goes running out again. But right here is where a lot of decisions are being made. And, as life goes on, this awareness right here with the body is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. As the body begins to break down, illness comes, pain comes. Soon you find yourself less and less able to do things you used to be able to do before. The mind gets more and more roped into being here, much against its will. But if you learn how to settle in here well in advance, you have a sense of how the awareness in the present moment can relate to the body in such a way that it doesn't have to suffer from the issues in the body. That way, aging, illness, and death are not much of a problem. They're simply issues of the body, but the mind doesn't have to suffer. So you want to get this moment, the present moment, more and more under your control. You want to get the mind under control. You want to get more and more familiar with the territory. It's as if someone is threatening to mug you at a certain corner, so you go down and look at the corner and you figure out, where are the escape routes that allow you to run away? How can you escape? How can you get through safely? So get to know this spot. Get to know how thoughts arise in the present moment, how they take shape, how they get nourished by your attention, and how you can start some thoughts if you find that they're unhealthy or unhelpful. There are lots of things to learn here. But even though this is our home, we won't be spending all of our time at home. There are times when you have to think about the past or about the future. Someone was telling me the other day that they heard someone say that if you're thinking about the past and future, you're suffering. If you're in the present moment, you're not suffering. Well, that's not the case. It makes it sound as if, to avoid suffering, you can simply not think as you hang out in the present moment. That may avoid a few kinds of suffering, but that's not how the Buddha taught. He taught people to think, and to think in the long term. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? That's the question that lies at the beginning of wisdom and discernment. So to be discerning, you've got to think out to the long term as to what is really important. And that gives you a perspective on the present moment. In fact, when the Buddha talks about the importance of being right in the present moment, and it's interesting that he doesn't talk about it that much, but when he does, it's because he realized that there are things that have to be done before you die if you want to die well. In other words, to die with skill. You don't know how much time you've got. You can spend a lot of time planning for your old age, and then it turns out that you don't live till old age. Something happens before then. So you want to be ready to go at any time. It's like knowing that there's a fire off in the distance, and you might be called on to evacuate at any moment. You need to have your valuables packed. But you can't take all your valuables. You have to figure out which things are important, and you have to keep them ready at hand, so that when the time comes to go, you pick up the bag and you're gone. You've got all the important things with you. But when you think about the long term, how does that reflect back on the present moment? It points to what's important in the present moment. The shape of your mind is important. When anything comes up in the mind that could pull you away, saying, "We'll have a little entertainment right now," or "Think about this because you like this or that," you have to look at the long-term consequences. In other words, the Buddha is not telling us not to think about the past or the future, he's telling us how to think about the past and the future. In terms of the past, he wants you to be mindful, to remember the good Dhamma lessons you've learned from the past. That includes not only what you've heard or read in terms of the Dhamma, but also what you've learned from your own actions. What kinds of actions lead to harm? What kinds of actions don't lead to harm? You learn how to take responsibility for looking at what's going on, and not just going on, but also looking at how you shaped your life, and trying to learn lessons from what you've done as to how better to shape it now and in the future. This directs your thoughts from the past to the future. The future doesn't end with death. It goes beyond, and it goes beyond in a particular way. There are some religions that say that, after you die, it's either eternal damnation or eternal bliss. But those teachings don't really encourage you to look at your actions, because there is no human action that could possibly earn eternal damnation or earn eternal bliss. So you're left hanging. And it all sounds very arbitrary. Somebody else out there is making the decisions, which means that you're not making the decisions, which doesn't encourage you to learn from your actions. But the Buddha doesn't teach that way. He teaches another way. He says that your actions do shape the future, and the results in the future are going to be proportional to your actions. Yet a lot of things go into deciding what that proportion is. And if you don't really get your act together, the process is just going to keep going on, and on, and on, up and down, up and down. As he said, it's like throwing a stick up in the air. Sometimes it lands on this end, sometimes it lands on the other end, sometimes it lands flat in the middle. If we just follow the line of one person's many lifetimes, it seems pretty random. But when you see the larger picture, you realize that your actions are the factor determining the long-term course. This is why it's good to reflect on the past actions that you've done, the ones that had good results, the ones that had bad results, and ask yourself what lessons you can learn as you head into the future. So it's not just being in the present moment or hanging out in the present moment that counts as practice. Learning how to think properly about the past and think properly about the future. Those are important aspects of the practice, too. They put the present moment into perspective. Because if you don't get the right perspective on the present moment, there can be a lot of suffering. Even just trying to be right here in the present moment, if you haven't learned how to master the present moment, can entail a lot of suffering right here. There's the suffering of the aggregates, there's the suffering of clinging and craving. These are things that we have to sort out. Once we have sorted them out, that's a real treasure. That's a valuable that you want to make sure is in your bag, so that when the time to evacuate comes, you've got good things to see you through. A lot of people just stuff their little bag with all kinds of garbage, whatever's at hand, and blame all their suffering on the fact that the fire is going to come. Well, the fires of aging, illness, and death are coming, burning us all the time. That's not something we can change. What we can change is what we take with us, what we salvage from this burning house. So even though concentration provides us with a home here in the present moment, it's a burning house. For the time being, as we work on our concentration, we try to find a room to stay where it's cool, where things are fireproof or relatively fireproof, so we can figure out what's going on in the rest of the house. But there will come a time when you can't even stay in this room anymore. So where do you go? This is one of the reasons why, when we work on concentration practice, we try to get ultimately to a sense of just awareness in and of itself. In the beginning, a lot of the concentration is a matter of learning how to stay with the breath, To get to the point where the mind and the breath, your awareness and the breath seem to be one. Wherever there's awareness, there's breath. Wherever there's breath, there's awareness. But you don't want to stay at that stage. You want to move on to the next stage, which is learning to see that, as these things sit together for a while, they begin to separate naturally. It's easiest to see when you get the mind still to the point where the breath is actually still as well, and the sense of the body begins to dissolve. Then you've got awareness just on its own. When you learn to maintain that sense of awareness on its own, you come to see, this is how the body impinges on your awareness in the present moment, but then there's the awareness itself, which is something separate. You first see this clearly at times when the sense of the body goes, but it's really useful to be able to maintain that sense of awareness as something separate, even when your awareness of the body is there as well. That's a much safer home. It, too, has its burning edges, but it's a lot safer. And it's by hanging on to the awareness that you make sure that you're in a much better position to notice what's coming and what's going. How the mind latches onto things, and how it doesn't have to latch onto things. That's when you've got a real treasure. And it'll be found here in the present moment. You're not going to find it in the past or in the future. But when you learn how to think properly about the past and think properly about the future, it really helps focus you on what's important in the present moment. We talk about developing alertness as to what's going on in the present. But its focus is not just on whatever's happening in the present. Its focus is on what you're doing. Why? Because that's the lesson coming from the past and aiming at the future. You've got to really focus on what you're doing because that's the most important thing happening in the present moment, for the sake of your happiness now and on into the future. We're not here just to be aware of whatever impinges on your awareness, because there are lots of things in the present moment that are really irrelevant to the big issues. The fact that the present moment is burning, this home in the present moment is burning, and you've got to develop the skills that enable you not to get burned. So think of the practice as an all-around practice. We're not just practicing in the present moment. We're also learning how to engage the past and engage the future, so that the lessons of the past don't get lost, and so that the future does hold out the prospect that someday you'll find something lying beyond past, present, and future. That's the place that's really safe. The Buddha doesn't talk about it as being a home, because home is an area where you go to find shelter from something. But when you're there, there's no need for shelter. In the meantime, though, you've got to keep this present moment shelter as solid as you can. Because this is where the work that needs to be done can get done well. Breath versus distraction. January 28, 2016. Just sitting here with nothing to do is very ordinary. It's so ordinary that the mind doesn't stay here very easily. It seems ordinary, but if you learn how to ask questions about it, you find that the more questions you ask, the stranger it gets. You've got this body, and you've got the mind that's aware. What are they doing here together? How do they relate to each other? A famous Zen master, Dogen, recommended asking questions like this. Is the body sitting in the mind, or is the mind sitting in the body? Which is the container for the other one? Or does there have to be a container? The reason for asking these questions is to start probing around into your assumptions about how you relate to your body, how you relate to your mind. And you can move your awareness fully into the body itself, this breath that we're focusing on. What is the breath? Viewed from the outside, people say that it's the air coming in and out through the nose, going into the lungs, and then coming back out again. But how does it feel to you inside? Like that old Peanuts cartoon where Linus comes up to Lucy and says, "Feel my hands, they're cold," and she says, "Yes, they are cold, but how do you know they're cold when you're inside them?" The way you look to people outside is one thing, but the way you experience the body from the inside, the mind from the inside, is something else. And it's good to explore this area inside to see how it's not quite what you thought it might be. That gives you something to get interested in as you sit here. Like the breath energy. We say that it flows through the body. But does it flow through the solid parts? In other words, are the solid parts there first, so that you have to pump the breath into them? Or does your awareness of the solid parts actually come to you through the breath? If it weren't for the breath, you wouldn't know they were there. So think of the breath energy as being there first. Thinking in this way can be very useful. If there's a pain in one part of the body, you may find yourself putting up a little wall of tension right around it to contain it there as you breathe in, and the breath energy seems to stop at the wall. As you do that, the circulation of the blood, the energies in the body, get blocked and discombobulated. But if you remember that the breath comes first, you reason that it shouldn't be the case. That anything else in the body should block the breath. Think of the breath as already there, and your awareness of the breath is there prior to your awareness of anything else. So learn how to ask yourself a few strange questions about what it's like to just be sitting here, breathing. That's one of your first defenses against distracting thoughts, because you're experimenting, finding things out, asking questions that you've never thought to ask before. Even if you have thought of asking them before, you can still explore. There's a lot to explore in the relationship among the body and the mind and the breath. That way, when a distracting thought comes up, it doesn't have the pull it used to have, because it's not as interesting, because you have something fascinating here to explore. If you're sitting here with nothing to do and nothing to think about and no questions about what's going on right now, then you start asking questions like, well, what about last week? And what about next week? And what about what I'm going to do when I leave here? And all of a sudden those questions become a lot more interesting than the breath. But if you can tune into this level of interest with the breath, then you find that questions about last week and next week are really not so absorbing after all. Here it is, your own relationship to your own body, and it's something you haven't really explored. Your own relationship to your own mind and your own breath. Here's your chance to get to know these things. This way, if a distracting thought comes, it's easy to follow through with the Buddha's first instructions for dealing with distracting thoughts, which is to replace them with a more skillful thought, in this case, coming back to the breath, because there's still more to explore. Now, if those thoughts have a pull that keeps pulling you back, that's a sign that you're attracted to them for some reason or another, which is why his second method of dealing with distracting thoughts is to try to see their drawbacks. And a lot of this has to do with karma. As the Buddha said, the thoughts that your mind tends to go to bend the mind in their direction, and you find yourself acting under their influence. All too often, the mind's excuse is, well, nobody knows what I'm thinking, and it doesn't have any impact on the world outside, so I should be free to think anything I want. And you are free, but is that the best use of your freedom? If a thought comes up in the mind, ask yourself, if I thought this thought for 24 hours, where would it lead me? Remind yourself of how most of the distracting thoughts that come up in the mind, the ones that have a lot of pull, are things you thought many times before. They're like old movies. You know what Lauren Bacall is going to say. You know what Humphrey Bogart is going to say. So why do you keep watching them? Of course, in the case of a lot of these thoughts, the actors are not Lauren Bacall or Humphrey Bogart. They're just a bunch of amateurs, and the acting is horrible. So what's the pull? What's the interest? And it is important that you think about the consequences of your thinking. Where is this thought going to lead you? I've been reading a series of anecdotes about Ajahn Chah recently, things that haven't been translated into English yet. And there's one where a monk comes to him and complains that as he sits and meditates, thoughts of lust take over his mind, and he doesn't know what to do. So Ajahn Chah says, that's easy. When the next one frog comes, that's the day when the lay people come to the monastery for the lunar Sabbath. When the next one frog comes, we'll have you get up in the sermon seat and have you describe to all the lay people out there all of your sexual fantasies from the past week. The monk suddenly found it a lot easier to put those thoughts aside. In other words, if you realize that your thoughts have consequences, you have to ask yourself, is this where I want to go? Then it's a lot easier to apply the teachings on inconstancy, stress, and not self to those thoughts to see that you really don't want to go there. You want to step out. And this is what the breath is for. It gives you a place to step out of those thoughts. Our problem is that when a thought comes, we tend to jump right into it. This is what the Buddha calls becoming. A thought world appears in your mind, and we go into it 100%. So we have to learn how to counteract that tendency, because sometimes you jump into a thought world only to find that it's pretty bad. And if you're used to jumping in and wallowing in a thought world, then it's harder to get out. But if you can have a sense of the breath as your safe place and the thoughts being less real than the breath, then it's easier to pull out. It's like being in a bad dream and realizing, hey, this is a dream, I don't need to keep dreaming this. All the concerns about being at the airport, and you can't get to the plane, and your luggage isn't there, and all these other things. You realize, hey, wait a minute, this is a dream, and then the concerns about luggage and whatnot, they're gone. So learn to see your thoughts as that ephemeral and the issues in the thoughts as that unreal, because you've got bigger issues to deal with. You've got a mind that's out of control. You've got to do something about it, and here's your chance to step out. Notice how the Buddha lists these ways of dealing with distracting thoughts. First, you simply give yourself something better to think about. Then you look at the drawbacks of the thoughts that otherwise would pull you away. When you've seen the drawbacks, even if you have trouble not getting interested in those things, it makes it a lot easier to do the next two steps, one of which is to just ignore the thoughts. In other words, they're there, but you don't have to go after them. The thoughts don't destroy the breath. The breath is still here. So even though all kinds of dialogues and shouting matches are going on in your head right now, you don't have to get involved. You've realized that these things have drawbacks, so why get involved with them? Even though there may be a tendency for the mind to keep spinning out in that direction, you don't have to go spinning with it. The breath is here. It's like a crazy person coming to talk to you. If you try to chase the crazy person away by arguing with him, the crazy person's got you. So you pretend that the crazy person's not there. You hear him and you know what he's saying, and he's going to say all kinds of outrageous things to get to you, but you have to be firm in your resolve. You're not going to get involved. After a while, he'll go away. Even if he doesn't, you've got another trick up your sleeve, which is to breathe through the tension in the body that corresponds to the thought. The more you get sensitive to what the breath can do and how the breath relates to your thoughts, you'll begin to realize that for a thought to stay in the mind, there has to be a pattern of tension someplace in the body. It's your marker. So you can go through all the different parts of the body and ask yourself, when this thought comes, what tenses up? See what happens if you can locate that tension and release it. It may not necessarily be where you expect it to be. It's not always in the head. Sometimes it's in an arm. Sometimes it's in a knee. It can be almost any place. If that technique doesn't work, then just grit your teeth and, as the Buddha said, press your tongue against the roof of your mouth and resolve, I am not going to think that thought. And of course the object of your meditation at that point is the thought, I am not going to think that other thought, which may not be the blissful calm state of dealing with the breath that you want, but if it's necessary, that's what you do. If you think of these different methods as tools, this is your sledgehammer. A variation of this one is to have a meditation word that you just repeat very quickly in your mind, buddo, rapid fire, really fast. Think of all the cells in your body getting involved in the buddo. Keep that up for a while until the desire to go after that thought dissolves away. Then you can go back to the breath. What this all comes down to is that you make the breath as interesting as possible. Learn to develop an interest in what's going on right here, right now. You've got this body. You've got this mind. It's really strange. How can this mind, this awareness, be related to this lump of flesh? What's the connection? And which part of the lump of flesh are you aware of first? It turns out that it's the breath. It's not the lump, it's the energy. Keep that perception in mind, and see how it helps you relate to the body in a new way, and how it helps you relate to your mind in a new way as well. See the drawbacks of thoughts that would pull you into greed, aversion, delusion, or sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety, uncertainty. Have a strong sense that these things could take over your life if you're not careful, and the other techniques for dealing with distracting thoughts will come easily. You've shifted the balance of power inside so that you'll come out on top. In alignment with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the tremendous significance of sharing wisdom widely. At present, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page work into a user-friendly audio format. The responsibility to advance this noble endeavor now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's continue the age-old tradition of knowledge dissemination and the nurturing of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this undertaking, and together, we can effect profound and positive changes in the lives of many.